He's going to talk about changing the tires of a moving car, moving Spotify's data infrastructure from on-premise to GCP. Very high profile, kind of a poster child for GCP, so take it away.
Thank you. Awesome. First of all, thanks to your organization for having me. This is, I do a lot of talks and around the world. This is probably the best conference ever because I live down the block, which is fantastic. So travel expenses was great. Yeah, that's really cool. Beautiful day in New York City. And so I'm Wouter de Bie. I've been at Spotify for about 5 years, or actually celebrating my anniversary, 5-year anniversary this week. Used to be in Stockholm, now moved to New York, and I'm going to talk a little bit about moving servers to from our on-premise infrastructure to Google's cloud platform, while we obviously continue to operate our service. So I want to ask, has anybody ever tried this? Impressive. I did not find that video on YouTube because I was under the impression that it's impossible to change the tires of a moving car, but this is a bunch of people in Saudi Arabia who are brave enough to do this. And when I was thinking about what am I going to talk about at a serverless conference, and especially about our migration into Google Cloud Platform, they're actually changing them. This is not just taking off the tires. This came to mind, and I looked online, is it even possible to do this? And apparently so. And when you think about, for us, Spotify, moving our infrastructure from on-premise to cloud, we're sort of doing this, right? While our truck is moving, or while our car is moving, we're changing those tires, preferably without any end users noticing this. So I try to come up with a few questions, what can I share? Obviously, how do we do this? Why do we move to cloud, etc.? So I'm going to take you through a bit of the story. So first of all, why are we moving to the cloud? Spotify started 10 years ago. We launched in Europe, in Sweden, that was 8 years ago. And we built everything on-premise. So now all of a sudden we're moving, and I'll get into sort of the extent of this. We're moving all our infrastructure into the cloud. And people ask me, why are you doing this? Because it seems quite a big undertaking. And for us, it's all about focus. Spotify's business is streaming content. We do a lot of music. We recently started doing a little bit of video. And that's what we're good at. I think we're pretty good at streaming music. But we're not great at operating data centers, or at least we believe that will not be a better streaming service if we're better at operating data centers. And there are companies out there that are far better at operating data centers and operating that type of infrastructure than we can ever do. Think Amazon and Google. So think about that. Think about why do we want to move to the cloud? And we started this process about 2.5 years ago. We thought about, okay, we don't want to be in the business of operating data centers and even renting data center space. We want another company to do that for us. And then the question was which vendor do we pick, right? So the question that I get from a lot of people is, why did you choose Google's cloud platform? And that's a very good question. For us, at Spotify, it's all about data. Our competitive advantage, we believe, is the data that we have, the data that we gather from our users, and to be able to improve our service. So if you look at how data is used at Spotify, there are basically 4 different things. There is reporting that we'll have to always do towards record labels and license holders of the content that we provide. It's also the most boring part of data. It's just sending reports and giving licensors a lot of data so that in the end they can send us an invoice and artists get paid. Then there is understanding of business metrics. We want to understand how our business is doing, the amount of signups that we have, registered users, engagement, things like that. And then we would like to understand our product really well. So that's where we need data for how our users interacting with the product. But probably the most interesting thing and why data is so important for us is that we really believe that we can improve the product by use of data. One example is the recommendations that we give people. That's all based on data that we gather from our users, and we'll have to be able to process that and do stuff with it. So for us, data is the most important asset that we have. And that was taken into account when we chose a cloud vendor to move everything over. Now, we believe that Google is really the queen of big data. Google has written a ton of papers, starting with MapReduce. There's things like Bigtable, a whole bunch of technologies invented at Google that then is later became a product and we can leverage. And we started using those technologies, and just the portfolio that Google offers is I would say pretty awesome. BigQuery is amazing. So just to give you an example, on our on-premise infrastructure, we use Hive, Hadoop and Hive, and a query that took about 20 minutes in Hive ran about 12 seconds in BigQuery. And that's a game changer. It's orders of magnitude faster. And like these were ad hoc queries for our analysts. And those analysts, instead of starting a query, going for coffee, waiting 20 minutes, they could do so much more round trips, or they could run so many more queries and be more efficient in what they do. The way that data flow is used, which is sort of the next step from MapReduce in terms of batch processing, but it also enables us to do real-time processing in the same way, is great. Google PubSub, on-premise we use Kafka. We're replacing that with Google PubSub. It's really fast. Bigtable is really big, and it's pretty great. So we see that the product portfolio of Google has some interesting advantages, and we can leverage those when it comes to data. So to give you a little bit of an insight into what are we actually moving. This is, by the way, a picture. This is what it is to work at Spotify. You get to jump out of windows in pools, which is kind of cool. Anyway, so what are we really moving? It's everything. We're moving our services, we're moving data, the whole thing. And I'm personally a data architect, so I know most about the data side of things. So I'll be focusing on that. But if you have questions later on about services, don't hesitate to ask. Just a little bit of context. So Spotify currently has over 30 million subscribers. We have about 75 million active users on a monthly basis. They stream, or we have over 30 million songs available. We have 2 billion playlists that are generated by our users. And we're currently active in 59 markets. So it's not nothing. It's not we're, as a company, we're sort of between, we're definitely post-startup and sort of pre-IPO. 2,500 people work there, so we have quite a lot of stuff. And then that sort of translates to our infrastructure, where we have 4 data centers, 2 in Europe, 1 in London, Stockholm, Ashburn here on the East Coast, and then in San Jose on the West Coast. We have about 350 or more backend services. So Spotify is a large service-oriented architecture, small microservices that do one thing and one thing only. We have about 12,000 physical servers spread out over those 4 data centers. We have roughly more than 30 petabytes of data in our Hadoop cluster, which is about 2,300 nodes right now. And we run about more than 10,000 processing jobs every day. So it's kind of an undertaking to move that. Now, our idea is, so we are currently migrating. We are not done yet, so there's a lot of learnings for us. We started having talks about this about 2.5, 3 years ago. We've been actively experimenting with Google's platform for the last, I would say, 18 months. We anticipate that the whole migration will probably take another 18 months from now. So I hope to be able to do a similar talk in 18 months or 2 years from now, where I can tell you, okay, this is how it actually went. So we're in the midst of this whole thing. So this is what we're currently working on the data side. So we have a 2,300 node Hadoop cluster, and we're going to move parts of our MapReduce infrastructure to Google's Dataproc environment. And Dataproc it's comparable to Amazon's Elastic MapReduce, where you spin up clusters and you run your MapReduce code. We do a lot of MapReduce in, there's Python using MapReduce streaming, and then there's Scalding and Crunch, Apache Crunch. It's basically JVM or Java-based languages or frameworks to do MapReduce, and we basically can move them over to separate Dataproc clusters. One big thing with moving to the cloud is that we're going for a multi-project setup. So every small little domain has its own project. So think about if our recommendations team, recommendations is a backend service, it's some data processing, that is what we sort of call a domain, and that domain or service is then moved into a separate project. So each project will be able to spin up its own Dataproc clusters or multiple Dataproc clusters, and then therefore they're sort of separated. And that's a big difference from our 2,300 Hadoop cluster, where everything runs in the same environment and multi-tenancy is an issue. As I said, 30 petabytes of data in that single HDFS cluster. With the setup that we'll have with separate projects, we'll also move that data into different buckets in those different projects. As I said before, we're using Hive to do ad hoc queries. That's going to be fully replaced by BigQuery because it's so much faster. We currently use a system that we've open sourced called Luigi to schedule Hadoop jobs. And Luigi is not very suited, or Luigi is, we sort of outgrew Luigi. So we were taking the opportunity to build a new scheduling system that uses Docker, in this case Kubernetes, to run jobs in those different projects. And that system is even capable of still running stuff on-premise and running things in the cloud. As I said, Apache Kafka, we use it heavily for getting the events from clients into HDFS right now. But we're replacing that with Google PubSub. An interesting note here is that we're not even only using PubSub to deliver purely into Google Cloud Storage, but we're also started using PubSub to deliver data into HDFS. So even the on-premise infrastructure will be replaced, the event delivery infrastructure will be replaced by Google PubSub. We also see that we're a very heavy Cassandra user. And so we have tons of Cassandra clusters that power, say, our playlist system, that power user systems, etc. And that's all going to be replaced by Bigtable. And as you see, a lot of these services that we use are managed services. And that's exactly why we want to move to the cloud. Obviously operating bare bones hardware, physical hardware, has an additional layer of, you need to have people running around in a data center. But in terms of the operations that we mostly do on our server farm, is very similar when you manage the virtual machines. So we also believe that if we take that away and we use more of those managed services, that will give us the opportunity to focus more on the product that we have. Now, one question that we have is, okay, so we have all these nice managed services, and we have all that legacy or like current production stuff running, say MapReduce jobs that we run on premise. We could move everything to data flow, for example, but that requires people or teams to rewrite their MapReduce code into data flow code. So the question is, like, do we forklift everything and then start building new things, or do we rewrite everything so that when we migrate things, we're directly on a completely new stack? And this is a question that at least has kept me up for some time. But we basically came to the conclusion that we let teams themselves decide. So teams decide by themselves if they feel that adopting new technology and adopting a new stack, if that adds value to the stuff that they do, then they should. If they don't, then if there's no value in moving current stuff over to a new platform, then we can basically forklift. So one example, again, is some MapReduce jobs that are lying around that have been written 3-4 years ago. It's still maintained, but there's no real value in redoing these kind of things. We should be able to just take that and run it in the cloud. So how do we do all of this? Like, what is sort of the process behind, or the drivers behind this? And I would like to talk about that in terms of like challenges that we have. So the biggest challenges, or a few of the biggest challenges that we face are those. So how do we move 30 petabytes of data? 30 petabytes it's a lot of data. Like, how do we move that? And constantly keeping in the back of our heads that this is a moving vehicle, right? So we are those Saudis on top of that truck trying to move that 30 petabytes of data while we still have to process all the data. We still have to serve our customers, etc. And so how do we move data that is there? How do we move while data is flowing in? Because we do get terabytes of data every day from our users. How do we deal with dependencies? And as I said, like, we let teams decide how to move stuff, which also means that teams will have the opportunity to move autonomously. So given that there are a whole bunch of dependencies between data sets, between processing jobs, that's a very big task to figure out how to deal with those dependencies. We also would like to avoid a big bang migration. With a system like this, with 75 million users, with 2,500 people at Spotify, of which I would say half of them are in engineering, with 59 countries that we serve, we cannot afford ourselves to prepare everything and then from one day to the next flip a switch and be done. And then, so those are sort of more technical things. And it's also on an organizational level, like, how do we prioritize the migration of our infrastructure into the cloud? It's not always apparent for teams that this is a priority. And obviously, we don't want to stop innovating on our product while we migrate. We cannot tell all teams, say, like, you've got to migrate right now, and for the next 6 months, you cannot do anything else, because that would be sort of destroying our own business. So try to answer a bunch of those questions here. So how we think about moving 30 petabytes of data is, well, first of all, we just got to make sure that there's enough bandwidth between our data centers and in this case, Google. So what we've done is we've set up private peering, which is basically we tossed over a fiber cable to Google and say plug that into your own infrastructure. So we do private peering, and therefore we get like a lot of bandwidth instead of having to go over transit networks, basically over the internet, and that helps a lot. And at an early stage, we already started just moving data to Google Cloud. So from HDFS, we constantly run jobs to put stuff into Google Cloud Storage. And we start with data that's very cold. So like start archiving some data. And while we do that, we learn and we understand how to move while the car is still moving. So how do we move data that is coming in? How do we do that? This is actually fairly simple. So what we started doing is dual delivery of data in both GCS and into HDFS. And we built new, so as I said, we start using PubSub for both of this, but for a while we still have Kafka delivering data into HDFS, and we have PubSub delivering data into Google Cloud Storage. And when it comes to database snapshots that we do a lot as well, we just dump them to both HDFS and into GCS. So now how do we deal with those dependencies? And we're still in the midst of this. This hasn't really fully crystallized, so we don't have a mass migration yet of all these jobs. But this is sort of the thinking around this. So what we need to do is that data that is generated on-premise, we will have to synchronize to Google Cloud Storage. And also, data that is generated on Google Cloud, that eventually lands on Google Cloud Storage, we'll have to synchronize back into HDFS. So for a while, there will be quite a lot of data moving back and forth. Unfortunately, with 10,000 jobs, it's virtually impossible to sequence all the processing jobs. So we can't say, oh, this is where our data pipeline begins, and this is where it ends, and we can work backwards, or we can work from the front to the back. So it's a big spaghetti of dependencies. So we will just have to start somewhere. So if we take a processing job somewhere in the middle of that spaghetti, we will need to make sure that upstream dependencies and downstream dependencies are fulfilled. So therefore, we have to copy both directions. And a very important thing is sort of, again, autonomy of teams. So we need to make sure that teams are able to do this by themselves, which basically means we have to have infrastructure in place and let teams themselves decide how they are going to do this and talk to their upstream or downstream dependencies on how to, like, that they are moving and that things might have to change for their dependencies. Then how to avoid a big bang migration. So again, like a very, very important thing for us is to have infrastructure in place to be able to do this so that teams can move autonomously. And Spotify in general is a company that is very much focused on autonomy of teams, and this really, really helps us. We cannot rely on a centralized team that is going to do all this migration. We really need the help of everybody to make this happen. One thing that really helps in this is to make sure that ownership is clear. And this goes both for data side and services side. If you don't know which team owns what service or which team owns what data set, it's going to be very, very tricky. So we've done an additional sort of pass through the organization and making sure that all our assets, so services and data, are owned by teams. And the last one is, how do you prioritize a migration? As I said, there are other important product things that need to be done. So teams either work on the product stuff or they work on migrating. Well, one thing is just creating a sense of urgency. In case of our Hadoop cluster, we just made a decision, we're not going to grow our Hadoop cluster. So our Hadoop cluster is 2,300 nodes. When I started 5 years ago, we had ago, we had 35 machines, and so that has grown from 35 boxes to 2,300 nodes, and we're constantly growing because our user base grows. We have more features in the client. We just generate more data, but we said, okay, there is a cutoff point where we'll not extend our cluster anymore, and therefore it's up to everybody. If you still want to do data processing, you will have to migrate. So that's sort of creating a sense of urgency. And also, what we really try to do is try to add value for people moving. So once you move your data, you can actually expose that into BigQuery, and therefore you can be faster. Or once you've moved your data and you're processing, you can start using real-time features of data flow. And there's a list of those kind of things. So adding value was very, very important. I've got about 4 minutes left, so I was wondering if there are any questions. Please use that time, and otherwise we're done. Is there, yeah.
Are you going to use cloud functions? Have you played around with that at all?
We have not. Sorry. The question was, are we going to use cloud functions? Possibly. There's no active sort of architecture around this, but yeah, the cloud functions are one of those things where we see that we don't have to maintain a whole bunch of infrastructure in the future, and therefore, if teams see value in doing that, then yes, they should. So the question was are there any data sets that nobody claimed? Did we find any? Yes, we did. So because our Hadoop cluster has grown organically, keeping track of who owns what was a bit of a challenge, and especially in the good old days when Spotify was really small, we just had to go move fast, and we built up quite a bit of technical debt. So yeah, there's a bunch of data sets that have not been claimed, and therefore we're now just hunting down people and say oh, you're the last committer, maybe you should take ownership of these kind of things. So yeah.
You said focus is the main driver, but moving to companies that do other things besides running data centers, they're not focused. So what's up with that?
So I'm not completely sure if I understand your question.
You're moving away from your own data center because you want to focus.
Yeah.
You're moving to Google, but Google does a lot more other things. They're not focused.
Okay, so the question is we're moving, we want to focus on our own stuff, but we're moving to a company like Google that has other focuses than their cloud platform. Am I correct?
Yeah, if you believe focus is so important, then why it's so critical, then how do you have confidence in Google and their focus?
Okay, so how do we have confidence in Google's focus? Well, first of all, Google is a large company, but their cloud platform is a separate entity within Google or within Alphabet, and it's a different part of the business, and they have different business drivers. So we do believe that Google has a focus on operating a good cloud platform. One interesting thing there is that, and that's a question that I did not go into, but the question that I often get is, why do, Google's cloud platform is less mature than Amazon's, right? But we also believe that because we're quite a large customer for them, and an important customer, so we also get to build the platform with them together. And that is all, it's a lot about trust, honestly, but we see in our working together with Google that trust is there, and that they're very willing to improve their product and their platform because we have requirements. So if that wouldn't have been the case, then absolutely, I would agree on yeah, you guys are not focusing on what we want, and that's exactly the opposite of what we require, yeah. I think last question? I guess not. Thank you so much.
All right,